Have you ever wondered how a single moment, one unexpected phone call, can flip an entire life upside down? How an ordinary, exhausted single mother could stumble into a secret buried for half a century, a secret powerful enough that entire families, old money dynasties, and men in tailored suits would kill to keep it hidden. And here's the strangest part. This story doesn't begin with treasure or danger or history. It begins with a broken woman, a rusted boat, and a name she'd spent her whole life trying to forget. Because sometimes the most extraordinary journeys start in the places we least expect. At the bottom, on our worst day, when we think the world has already taken everything from us. So what really happened when Elena Cruz stepped onto that decaying yacht in the Florida Keys? And why did her life stop belonging only to her from that moment on? Let's dive in and uncover the truth together. Most people don't realize how quietly a life can fall apart in America. It doesn't happen with explosions or dramatic collapses. Most of the time, it's just one bill too high, one shift too long, one unexpected emergency that pushes someone from barely making it to not making it at all. That was where Elena Cruz lived, in that thin, invisible space between survival and surrender. Every morning she tied her hair back, slipped on her faded diner uniform, and reminded herself she could do this. She had to do this, because little Noah depended on her. She worked the breakfast shift at Sunrise Diner, then the late shift stocking shelves at a discount grocery store. And on weekends, she delivered takeout in an old sedan, whose check engine light was more reliable than the engine itself. You could say she was juggling 3 jobs, but really, she was juggling time, energy, and hope. And on most days, she barely had enough of any of them. The numbers were brutal. 40% of American single mothers live at or below the poverty line. And Elena felt every statistic in her bones. The rising rent, the medical bills she was still paying for Noah's broken arm from 2 years ago, the car insurance that threatened to lapse every month, and of course the ever-present fear of debt collectors, the kind of fear that makes your stomach tighten every time an unknown number pops up on your phone. She didn't have savings. She had survival mode. And yet, anyone who met her never saw bitterness. They saw tired eyes, yes, but not broken ones. Elena had that quiet kind of strength, the kind built from years of pushing forward even when the world never pushed back. Still, her life wasn't just about hardship. There were soft human moments, too. Noah doing homework in the booth at the diner while she wiped down tables. The way he always tried to hide his worn-out shoes so she wouldn't feel guilty. The way he hugged her after every shift, like he could sense the weight she carried. And Elena, despite everything, still found ways to make Noah laugh. Silly accents, cheap ice creams on discount days, star watching in the parking lot after late shifts. These moments didn't fix anything, but they reminded her that there was still something worth fighting for, that maybe, somehow, the universe hadn't given up on her completely. But the truth is, Elena was running out of road. Her landlord had hinted, twice, that he couldn't keep being lenient. Her car registration was overdue, and the diner manager had cut her hours because business slowed down after tourist season. That's the thing about living on the edge. There's no room to breathe, no room to slip, and no room to dream. And yet Elena still believed one thing deep down, that there had to be more to her story than this endless grind. She just didn't know when or if her more would ever come. Sometimes life tests us long before it reveals anything meaningful. Sometimes we are shaped by the days that feel the smallest, the most ordinary, the most exhausting. And sometimes, without warning, everything changes in the space of a single phone call. Elena didn't know it yet, but her entire world, every fear, every sacrifice, every unanswered question about her family, was about to collide with a truth far bigger than she could imagine. Because in just a few hours, while she was standing elbow deep in dishwater at the diner, her past would come knocking, and nothing in her life would ever look the same again. It happened on a Wednesday morning, the kind of morning that already felt heavy before it began. Elena was scrubbing the industrial sink at the diner, sleeves soaked, wrists burning from cheap latex gloves, when her manager poked his head in and said, "Phone call. Says it's a lawyer." For a split second, Elena froze. Lawyers weren't part of her world. Lawyers meant eviction notices, custody disputes, medical bills gone wrong. Her heart raced in that familiar sinking way, the way it does when you're sure bad news has finally found you. She wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the phone with a quiet, wary, "Hello?" The voice on the other end was crisp, polished, the kind of voice that belonged in conference rooms, not greasy diners. "Miss Elena Cruz? My name is Andrew Blake, from Blake and Donovan in Miami. I'm calling regarding the estate of Mr. Mateo Alvarez." The name struck her like a match in a dark room. Too bright, too sharp. Mateo Alvarez. A man she had never met. A name her mother refused to speak. A ghost in every sense. For a moment, Elena thought he had the wrong person, but the lawyer continued, calm and certain, explaining that Mr. Alvarez had passed away and left behind a single asset in her name, a vessel moored in the Florida Keys, a boat from a man she didn't even know. Shock, confusion, and a strange, hollow fear washed over her. In America, inheritance usually means comfort, legacy, maybe a second chance. But for millions of people living paycheck to paycheck, people like Elena, inheritance more often means debt, medical expenses, or trouble you didn't ask for. And something about this felt wrong. Why would a man who'd abandoned her family leave her anything? Why now? Why a boat? She tried to ask questions, but Andrew Blake only repeated that the paperwork would be emailed and the slip fees were paid through the end of the month. "You may want to visit soon," he added, with a tone that felt like a warning disguised as courtesy. When Elena hung up the phone, she stood silent in the humming kitchen, surrounded by clattering dishes and sizzling bacon, but feeling like the world had suddenly gone quiet. Her thoughts went straight to Noah. New shoes he needed, the overdue rent, the car that might not survive another month. She didn't have time for mysteries, much less a yacht. But buried beneath the fear was something else. A flicker of curiosity, the soft pull of a door she never expected to open. That night, after she put Noah to bed, she sat alone on the couch and searched the name Mateo Alvarez. Nothing. No obituary. No records. No social media. It was like he'd lived his entire life in the shadows. She found the marina he supposedly stayed at. Pelican Harbor, a place filled with forgotten boats and forgotten people. A place no one chooses unless they're hiding from something. It should have been enough to make her close the laptop and walk away. But she didn't. Because something in her, the part shaped by years of feeling small, unseen, unchosen, whispered that maybe this was her chance to understand where she came from, maybe even who she was meant to be. Early the next morning, she packed Noah into the back seat with a bag of snacks and drove toward the Florida Keys. The highway unwound slowly beneath them, lined with sun-bleached billboards, roadside fruit stands, and stretches of ocean that made everything look deceptively peaceful. Noah asked where they were going, and Elena simply said, "To see something your great-grandfather left behind." She didn't tell him she was scared. She didn't tell him that sometimes the past doesn't just open doors, it opens wounds. As the road curved toward the marina, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't inheriting a blessing at all, but a burden, a curse wrapped in salt, rust, and silence. And yet, she kept driving. Because when you've spent your whole life fighting just to stay afloat, even the strangest opportunity can feel like a lifeline or a test. And whichever one this was, she was about to find out. Pelican Harbor looked nothing like the glossy postcards that sold the dream of the Florida Keys. Instead of turquoise water and polished white decks, Elena and Noah stepped into a world that felt forgotten. Rows of boats listing to one side, hulls peeling like sunburned skin, masts creaking in the wind like tired old bones. It smelled of rust, salt, gasoline, and something else she couldn't quite name, the scent of abandoned stories. A few pristine yachts glittered in the distance like diamonds sitting in a junkyard. But most of what Elena saw were the leftovers of lives that didn't go as planned. In a strange way, it felt familiar. Life on the edge looked the same everywhere. It just had different scenery. The harbor master, a man with a weather-beaten face and eyes that seemed to measure people before he bothered speaking to them, took one look at Elena's paperwork and paused longer than she expected. Something flickered across his features, recognition, maybe even discomfort, before he motioned for them to follow. The dock groaned beneath their feet, wooden slats warped from years of storms and neglect. Noah clung to her hand, his eyes wide and curious, but Elena felt heat rising up her spine. A part of her wanted to turn back, but another part pushed her forward. She had come too far to walk away now, and then the harbor master stopped. "There she is," he said quietly. "La Luz." The boat was heartbreaking, not frightening, not grand, just heartbreakingly tired. The hull was streaked with algae, once white fiberglass, now stained with long, dark tears of rust. One window was cracked, another missing altogether. The wood trim along the deck had swollen and split in several places, and the ropes tying the boat to the dock looked like they had survived one hurricane too many. Noah whispered, "Mom, it looks like it's sinking," and she couldn't deny it. La Luz looked like a creature halfway between life and death, clinging stubbornly to the world, even as the world moved on without her. But beneath the rot, Elena sensed something else. Bones. Strong ones. The kind of structure you only find in vessels built with pride, skill, and money. The harbor master must have seen the way she studied it, because he said, "Don't judge her too fast. Boats like these, they're tougher than they look. Your grandfather, well, he knew what he had." The way he said it made Elena look up sharply. "People offered him good money," he murmured. "Real good. But he always refused. Said this boat was worth more than anyone realized." He didn't explain further. He just pressed the key into her hand and walked away like a man who'd said too much already. Boarding La Luz felt like stepping into a chapter of someone else's life. The door jammed, swollen from humidity, and Elena had to shoulder it open. Inside, the smell hit them: mildew, salt, old paper, and metal. It wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't rot either. It smelled lived in, like someone had occupied this place far longer than they intended. Maps were tacked to the walls, not neat, decorative maps, but layers upon layers of nautical charts with handwritten notes in the margins. A radio lay in pieces on the small table, surrounded by tools and wires. A stack of weathered journals sat in the corner, their pages swollen and crinkled. Every surface told the same story. Someone had been working here, obsessing over something, circling seas and coordinates long after most people would have given up. Noah wandered into a small cabin and called, "Mom, look." The bed was neatly made, too neatly for a man living on a sinking boat. Next to it sat a small shrine, a rosary, 3 melted candles, and a faded photograph of a young woman holding a baby. The sight of it made Elena's breath hitch. She didn't recognize the woman, but she recognized the man in the picture. Her father, younger and happier than she had ever seen him, and in his arms, a tiny infant Elena had never known existed in any photo. Her throat tightened. It's one thing to lose your family history. It's another to learn it was here, locked away, the whole time. Just when she thought she had taken in enough, something else pulled her attention. In the main cabin, along the starboard wall, a built-in panel didn't line up correctly with the interior dimensions. It looked normal at first glance, but the math didn't add up. The inside was narrower than the outside. Elena knocked on the panel. Hollow. Not empty, just hollow. She pressed along the edges. One section gave slightly beneath her palm, like there was something behind it. Something deliberately sealed away. Her stomach flipped. The instinctive kind of flip that tells you you're standing at the edge of a truth you might not be ready for. She didn't open it. Not yet. Some truths take time. Some require courage she didn't have in that moment. Instead, she stepped back, took Noah's hand, and said softly, "Let's go. We'll come back tomorrow." And as they walked off the boat, the wind carried the faint sound of someone shifting on a nearby deck. A man, pretending to work, glancing away too quickly when Elena noticed him. Her skin prickled. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was intuition. But she felt eyes on her, watching, waiting. La Luz wasn't just a forgotten boat. It was a trigger, a door, and somewhere beyond that door, someone else was listening. What Elena didn't know yet was that sometimes secrets rot the same way boats do, slowly, quietly, from the inside out, and the deeper you step into them, the harder it becomes to escape. She wasn't just inheriting a yacht. She was inheriting a past someone had spent decades trying to bury. And tomorrow, when she returned, the first crack in that buried truth would finally split open. The next morning, while Elena was folding laundry in her tiny living room and trying not to think about the hollow panel inside La Luz, there was a knock at the door. Not a friendly knock. A firm, confident, rhythmically measured knock. The kind that belongs to someone who already believes they'll be let in. When she opened it, a man in a charcoal gray suit stood on the porch. His smile too white, too polished, too rehearsed. He introduced himself as Victor Lang, representing a private client with interest in the yacht she had inherited. His tone was warm, but his eyes stayed flat and unreadable, like glass. Elena's stomach tightened. She hadn't told anyone about the boat. She hadn't even replied to the lawyer's email. And yet here he was. Victor stepped inside without waiting to be invited, commenting approvingly on the framed pictures of Noah on the wall. An oddly personal gesture from a stranger who claimed his visit was strictly business. He launched right into it. His client, he said, was prepared to offer her $60,000 in cash for Laluz, immediately. No inspections, no paperwork headaches, no delays. He slid a glossy black envelope across her kitchen table like he was dealing cards at a casino, confident she'd fold under pressure. $60,000 wasn't a number Elena heard often. It wasn't even a number she let herself imagine. It was more than 2 years of rent, more than the cost of a reliable car, more than she could ever save juggling minimum wage jobs. For someone living paycheck to paycheck, that kind of offer wasn't tempting, it was life-changing. But that's exactly why it didn't make sense. Why would anyone pay that much for a collapsing yacht, one she wasn't even sure could survive a storm without splitting in half? Why did he come to her door before she could even think? She told him she needed time. Victor nodded, smiled, and returned the next day with a new offer, $120,000, still in cash. No explanation, just pressure disguised as generosity, and then the smile shifted, just slightly, the way smiles do when someone stops pretending. He leaned back in his chair, clasped his hands, and said, "You know, Miss Cruz, boats like that come with responsibilities, fees, liabilities, sometimes danger. A single mother like you doesn't need that kind of burden." He said it like an observation, but it felt like a warning, a quiet, professional threat, wearing a tailored suit. This is the moment where survival instinct becomes more important than logic, something many single parents know too well. Elena felt it rise inside her, the same instinct that told her which streets not to walk after dark, which customers at the diner to avoid, which phone calls not to answer. Something wasn't right. No one throws piles of cash at a stranger without wanting something far more valuable in return. And people who want something that badly usually don't stop at polite offers. Victor stood to leave, but he paused at the doorway. "You should think carefully," he said softly. "Opportunities like this don't wait forever, and neither do consequences." His tone never changed, but his meaning did. It carried the same coldness Elna had heard from landlords, bill collectors, men who think power makes them untouchable. But this felt worse, much worse. When he was gone, the apartment felt smaller, like the walls had crept closer. Elna checked the lock twice. She looked at Noah, coloring quietly at the table, blissfully unaware of the shadow that had just walked through their door. And that's when the fear turned into something else. Resolve. Sometimes being a parent means standing still, even when every instinct is screaming to run. Sometimes it means trusting your intuition, even when the world tells you you're overreacting. As night settled in, Elena sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word Victor had said. The old boat, the hidden compartment, the strangers watching her at the marina. None of it fit together, but all of it pointed to one undeniable truth. Laluz was not just a rusted inheritance. It was a magnet. And whatever it was pulling toward her, it wasn't going to stop. By morning, she knew exactly what she needed to do. She grabbed a flashlight, a crowbar, a pair of gloves, and drove back toward the marina with a new determination. She was done guessing. It was time to open that panel and expose whatever secret Mateo Alvarez had hidden there before someone else came looking for it. The truth was waiting for her inside Laluz. And once she tore that panel open, nothing, not fear, not threats, not even money, would ever look the same again. The marina was quiet when Elena returned, too quiet, the kind of silence that carries a warning. She stepped onto La Luz with the flashlight gripped in one hand and the crowbar in the other, trying to ignore the way her heartbeat echoed louder than her footsteps. The cabin smelled the same as before: damp paper, rusted metal, and something old enough to feel like memory itself. She didn't waste time. She knelt beside the suspicious panel, slid the crowbar into the narrow gap she'd found the day before, and pushed. The wood groaned, cracked, and finally gave way with a sharp snap that seemed to split the entire room in half. Behind it, in a long, narrow cavity running the length of the hull, were dozens of rectangular bundles, each wrapped in decaying canvas and layers of oilcloth. Her breath caught. Instinct told her this was bigger than anything she'd imagined. She pulled one bundle out, heavy and cold, the weight so dense it almost startled her. She unwrapped the layers slowly, hands trembling, until the metal case inside slid into her lap, and when she opened it, the cabin seemed to exhale. Gold, a bar the size of a paperback book, stamped with numbers, purity markings, and a seal she didn't recognize, at least not at first. It wasn't just gold. It was official, deliberate, government marked. And as the beam of her flashlight moved across the engraving, her stomach twisted. Banco Nacional de Panama, 1968. The year burned into her mind. Something about it felt familiar, like a half-remembered lesson from a dusty high school textbook. She pulled out her phone with shaking fingers, searching frantically, and within seconds, the screen lit up with a history that made her blood run cold. In 1968, during a military coup in Panama, a massive portion of the nation's gold reserves vanished. $20 million worth back then, over $100 million in today's value. Official reports claimed rogue officers had stolen it. 3 men were arrested, tried, executed. Their families insisted they were innocent, that they were scapegoats caught in a political storm, and then the gold disappeared from history. No trace, no recovery, just silence. The story felt unreal, like something out of a conspiracy documentary, but the bar in her hand was very real. So were the dozens of bundles stacked neatly behind the panel. Gold like this doesn't just get misplaced. It doesn't drift onto a yacht in the Keys by accident. Someone carried it, someone hid it, someone protected it for decades. And whoever that someone was, it had to be Mateo Alvarez. Her grandfather wasn't just a man who left his family behind. He was a man who disappeared into a secret big enough to erase an entire future. As she scrolled through articles and fragments of old reports, a name appeared, again and again. Captain Diego Herrera, one of the officers executed in 1968, accused of orchestrating the theft, condemned as a traitor. But his family claimed he was trying to stop the real criminals, government officials and foreign operatives working together. Elena opened an archived photograph of him, grainy and faded, and she froze. The face staring back at her had her eyes, her jawline, her entire profile, only sharper and stronger. Diego wasn't just a stranger from history, he was family. Mateo had been hiding more than gold. He had been hiding the name of a man history had erased, because history had been written by the people who stole the truth. That realization hit harder than the gold. because in that moment, Elena understood something people rarely talk about out loud. We inherit more than blood. Sometimes we inherit unfinished stories, stories buried under lies, fear, and decades of silence. And those stories come looking for us, whether we want them or not. Her hand shook as she wrapped the gold bar back up, not because of its value, but because of its weight. Moral, emotional, historical. Noah was waiting at home. One wrong move could destroy everything, but walking away felt just as dangerous, because gold like this remembers. It remembers the men who died for it, the families torn apart by it, the governments built and broken on the backs of secrets like these. And now, whether she wanted it or not, the gold remembered her. As she replaced the panel, Elena felt something shift inside her. Fear, yes, but also clarity. There were people who knew this gold still existed, people willing to pay 6 figures in cash, people willing to threaten her without blinking. They weren't after her. They were after what Matteo left behind. And now she had touched it, opened it, awakened it. She locked up the boat and stepped onto the dock, feeling the warm night air brush her face. But the air didn't calm her. It pressed in, thick with the sense that her next move would matter in ways she couldn't yet understand. The truth was bigger than a rusted yacht, bigger than the gold, bigger than her fear, and it was waiting for her in the depths of her own family's past. And as she walked toward her car, one thought echoed through her mind, with a gravity she couldn't ignore. If the gold could survive 50 years of silence, what else had survived with it? The answer, she would soon learn, was already watching her from the shadows. That night, after Noah fell asleep with his sketchbook still open across his chest, Elena sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the gold bars she'd wrapped back in canvas and hidden inside a grocery bag. The apartment felt colder than usual, quieter, in a way that made her pulse throb in her ears. She knew what she had to do. Maybe she should have done it years ago. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in months, her mother's. The ring dragged on, and for a moment Elena prayed it would go to voicemail. But then the familiar voice answered, sharp and alert, like she'd been bracing for bad news her whole life. Elena, is Noah okay? It was always the first question, always the fear beneath every conversation. Elena swallowed hard. He's fine. Mom, I need to ask about Matteo. Silence, not the kind filled with static, but the kind that means someone is deciding whether to tell the truth or run from it. Her mother sighed, a sound full of decades of resentment. Your grandfather walked out on us, on your father, on everyone. He took that damn boat and vanished. Her words were steady, but the pain beneath them wasn't. He said he had to protect us, but protect us from what? He just disappeared. Elena pressed her forehead into her hand, her throat tightening. She wanted more than excuses. She wanted answers. Did Dad ever tell you why? Did he ever say anything about Panama? About 1968? Another pause. Longer this time. No. And I didn't want to know. Some things, her mother said, voice cracking like old wood, are safer buried. There it was, that word again. Buried. As if the truth were a body underneath a floorboard, wrapped in plastic and silence. Elena felt anger rise, not at her mother, but at the legacy of secrets that had shaped them both. Her whole life, she'd felt the weight of something she couldn't name, and now she finally knew why. Her family had been living inside a ghost story without ever knowing its beginning. Before she could press for more, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Your grandfather kept the truth alive. Don't let them erase it. Slip 14. Midnight. Come alone. Every instinct told her to delete the message. But another instinct, the one that had kept her alive through years of hardship, told her she couldn't ignore it. Fear doesn't only warn us when danger is near. Sometimes it warns us when the truth is. Pelican Harbor looked different at midnight. The lights were softer, the water darker, the silence deeper. Elena kept her keys between her fingers like her mother once taught her, just in case. Slip 14 held a worn sailboat, cleaner than Lalou's, but still marked by years of salt and storms. A faint glow from inside cast a thin beam onto the dock. She stepped aboard, her heart pounding. "Ms. Cruz," a voice said from the shadows, "thank you for coming." An older man emerged, thin, weathered, hair silvered by sun and age. His eyes were sharp, alive, the kind you don't get from a quiet life. He introduced himself as Luis Ortega, a sailor who once served beside her grandfather. He poured her a cup of coffee from a dented thermos, his hands trembling with age, but steady with purpose. And then he began to speak, not with drama, not with flair, but with the tired honesty of a man who had carried a truth too long. He told her about 1968, not as something he'd read in a book, but as something he had lived. Captain Diego Herrera, Elena's great-uncle, discovered the plot to steal Panama's gold reserves. Not petty criminals, not opportunists, high-ranking officials, some local, some foreign, men who saw entire nations as pieces on a board. Diego fought to stop them. He failed. But before they could complete the theft, he did the only thing he could. He took the gold himself, not to keep it, but to keep it out of their hands. Elena felt the air drained from her lungs as Luis continued. Diego's arrest, his execution, his refusal to confess to a crime he didn't commit, his belief, his dying belief, that Panama would one day need the truth. And Mateo, her grandfather, was there for all of it. Diego told him where the gold was hidden, told him to protect it, told him to disappear. And Mateo obeyed. He cut himself off from family, from safety, from love. He became a ghost so the truth could survive. Elena stared at her hands, trying to imagine the weight her grandfather had carried. How many nights had he slept in fear? How many times had he tried to come home but couldn't risk it? How much guilt did he swallow, knowing his own family thought he'd abandoned them? She'd always assumed distance meant indifference. She never considered it might have meant sacrifice. Luis slid a worn envelope across the table. "He left these for you," he said. "He knew this day would come. He hoped you'd be the one brave enough to face it." Inside were bank contacts, encrypted notes, maps, and a letter in Mateo's handwriting. She couldn't bring herself to read it. Not yet, because something else hit her harder, a truth she couldn't ignore. Secrets don't break families because they're dark. They break families because they stay silent. The gold on Lalou's wasn't just a fortune. It was a story, a wound, a responsibility, and that responsibility now belonged to her, whether she wanted it or not. As the first hint of sunrise touched the water, Elena stepped off Luis's boat with shaking hands and a heart full of something she hadn't felt in years. Clarity. She wasn't running from a mystery anymore. She was walking toward it. And soon she would walk into the den of the people who had been hunting her grandfather for decades. The ghosts had spoken, and she was ready to answer. 2 days after meeting Luis, Elena walked into the shimmering glass tower of the Meridian Club, a private penthouse restaurant known for its velvet curtains, panoramic views of Biscayne Bay, and a membership full of people who never heard the word no. The kind of place where lunch costs more than her weekly groceries and where old money families negotiate futures like they're trading cards. She wore her only decent black dress, simple and plain, but she held her head high. Not because she felt confident, she didn't, but because fear had stopped being an option the moment she discovered gold that could rewrite history. Victor Lang greeted her in the marble lobby, his smile thinner than last time. He escorted her to a private dining room where 3 people waited: Eleanor Whitmore, elegant and cruel in the way only generational wealth can make possible; Charles Whitmore, mid-40s, polished like a politician, his eyes cold behind designer glasses; and Olivia Whitmore, younger, sharper, charming, with a venom that moved quietly under her tone. These weren't just wealthy people. These were the descendants of the men Diego Herrera tried to stop, the people whose power had been built on stolen gold and buried truth. Eleanor didn't stand to greet her. She simply offered a tight smile and said, "Ms. Cruz, thank you for coming. Let's make this simple." Her voice carried the ease of someone who buys land, companies, and maybe even silence with the same hand wave. Dishes arrived in a quiet parade: fresh seafood, artisan bread, chilled wine, but Elena barely looked at them. Charles leaned forward first, tapping a manicured finger on the table. "We understand you've come into possession of an asset," he began smoothly. "An asset that never legally belonged to your grandfather." The words dripped with entitlement, like the law itself was something their family had handcrafted generations ago. Olivia crossed her legs, studying Elena like she was an intriguing new exhibit. "The boat isn't the point," she said softly. "What's in it is." Her eyes gleamed with something like hunger. "You have no idea what kind of trouble gold like that brings." Elena held her breath. She had expected manipulation, maybe even threats. But what surprised her most was their confidence, their absolute certainty that she would break. People like the Whitmores didn't beg. They controlled, they erased, they assumed everyone else needed something from them. So, when Eleanor slid a slim folder across the table, Elena already knew what was inside: an offer. $300,000. Cash, no strings. At least, none they would admit. More money than Elena had ever imagined holding. "Take it," Eleanor said softly, "and give us the boat. You get a fresh start, a safe life for your son, no questions asked, no complications." The air shifted. Charles leaned back, studying her. Because complications can get ugly, fast. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His threat sat between them like a fourth course. Olivia added, "Accidents happen, especially to people who don't understand the world they've stepped into." She said it almost kindly, which somehow made it even worse. For a moment, Elena felt the room tilt. She wasn't built for this world, their world. She didn't speak their language of power, legacy, or bloodline politics. But she understood something deeper. Fear is only useful to people who believe they already own you. And these people, these polished predators, believed Elena was prey. But she wasn't. Not today. Because, tucked beneath her dress, clipped to the lining just above her waist, was a tiny recording device, one given to her by Dana Kim, an investigative journalist, known for exposing the kind of corruption most citizens never see. And everything the Whitmores said, the threats, the confession by implication, the acknowledgement that they'd been hunting that gold for decades, was now captured in crystal clarity. So, instead of folding, Elena smiled, a small one, quiet, steady, the kind of smile that makes powerful people pause because they don't know what it means yet. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "Truly. But I need time to consider." And before they could corner her again, she stood, thanked them politely, and walked out of the room with steps that felt like they belonged to someone braver than she had ever been. In the elevator, as the doors slid shut, Elena finally let her body shake, not from fear anymore, but from something sharper, resolve. She looked at her reflection in the mirrored wall, hair slightly messy, dress too plain for a place like this, and whispered to herself, "They don't get to decide how this ends." Outside the tower, the sun hit her face with blinding warmth. She pulled out her phone and messaged Dana one word, "Got it." For the first time, Elena understood a truth her grandfather had known all too well. Sometimes the only way to survive the powerful is to stop running and start exposing them. And now she had the recording. She had the story. She had the leverage. The hunters didn't know it yet, but their prey had just turned around. And the moment Elena pressed send, everything in their world began to unravel. Next, she would have to decide what to do with the truth she now carried, and how far she was willing to go to protect the future her family was never allowed to have. The night after the meeting at the Meridian Club, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to Noah breathe softly in the next room, his small frame curled into the safety of childhood dreams. Dreams she feared she might shatter if she made the wrong choice. On the kitchen table sat the envelope Louise had given her, next to the tiny recorder holding every threat, every confession, every slip of arrogance from the Whitmores. It was proof. It was leverage. It was danger. Outside, the streetlight flickered in a way that made her feel exposed, as though the night itself was warning her that time was running out. And maybe it was. At dawn, she called Dana Kim, the investigative journalist who had guided her through this maze of power and corruption. Donna listened to the recording in silence, and when it ended, she exhaled slowly. "You have no idea how big this is," she whispered. "You've just cracked open a 50-year conspiracy, but you've also painted a target on your back." She offered a plan, one built on discretion, encrypted files, trusted contacts, and legal strategies. But the first step was the hardest. Elena and Noah had to disappear. Not forever, just long enough to stay ahead of the storm that was coming. Elena didn't hesitate. She packed a single duffel bag with clothes, grabbed Noah's school backpack, and told him they were going on a little trip. She didn't tell him that powerful families had already begun making calls, that investigators might be searching for her, that the Whitmores were used to erasing problems, not negotiating with them. Louise arranged everything. At sundown, Elena and Noah met him at a small dock on the opposite side of the marina, far from Pelican Harbor's usual traffic. A friend of his, a quiet man with weathered hands and kind eyes, guided them onto a modest fishing boat. No questions, no judgment. Just the understanding that sometimes the only way to survive is to move in silence. They crossed the dark water toward the Bahamas, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the stars to guide them. Noah fell asleep, head in Elena's lap, unaware of the fear thundering through her body. She stroked his hair gently, thinking about the two paths laid before her. One path was simple: take a handful of gold bars, disappear forever, live comfortably under new names in some quiet town where no one asked questions. Plenty of people would choose that, maybe even most. But the other path, the dangerous one, was to finish what Diego and Mateo started. It meant giving the truth back to the people it belonged to. It meant exposing the Whitmores, confronting a history that had been bent and twisted for generations. It meant risking everything. Elena felt the crossroad like a weight on her chest. One choice gave Noah safety. The other gave him meaning. And sometimes those two things don't coexist. That's the cruel math of morality: comfort or conscience, survival or justice, quiet anonymity or a legacy carved from truth. But for Elena, the choice became clearer with every mile they traveled away from the shore. Diego had died, trying to protect something bigger than himself. Mateo had sacrificed his entire life to hide the gold and keep the truth alive. Elena had spent her whole life believing she came from a line of broken men, but now she knew she came from a line of fighters, and fighters don't run. They reposition. They strike back. Over the next several weeks, Elena, Noah, and Luis moved carefully through the Caribbean, small ports, quiet guest houses, borrowed names. Meanwhile, Dana built the case piece by piece, working with human rights lawyers, archivists, and historians who had been searching for answers for decades. Elena sent encrypted files whenever service allowed: photos of the gold, scans of Mateo's journals, Luis's testimony. She watched the story take shape from afar, knowing that once it went public, there would be no undoing it. There were moments when fear overwhelmed her, like when a black SUV appeared outside one of the small inns they stayed at, or when she spotted a man on a dock holding a camera just a little too steadily. But each time, Luis reminded her, "Truth is a long game, Nina. The powerful depend on silence. Break that, and they lose everything." And so she kept going. She let the truth gather momentum. She let the evidence breathe. She let the world get ready for a story that had been buried under the weight of gold and lies. Meanwhile, Noah asked one night under a quiet Costa Rican sky, "Mom, are we the good guys?" Elena pulled him close, the question piercing her heart. She didn't answer right away, because being the good guys didn't make them safe, and doing the right thing didn't guarantee a happy ending. But it did guarantee something else, something she had never been able to give him before: purpose. "We're trying to be," she finally whispered, "and sometimes that's what matters most." As the days passed, the question weighed on her: was she risking too much? Was she becoming reckless? Was she repeating her grandfather's mistakes or honoring his courage? The truth is, moral decisions are rarely clean. They are messy, uncomfortable, frightening. They require giving up pieces of yourself long before you know if the sacrifice was worth it. But the closer they got to justice, the more Elena understood something her grandfather must have known all along. Peace bought with silence isn't peace at all. It's just a quieter kind of prison. And with that realization, the final stage of her journey began. The gold would soon begin moving, piece by piece, toward the country it was stolen from. The story would break, the world would awaken, and the Whitmores were about to learn that The family they thought they had erased had just risen from the shadows, stronger, louder, unstoppable. Elna wasn't running anymore. She was coming home with the truth, and the world was about to hear it. For months, Elena lived in motion, never in one place, long enough to leave a trail, never still long enough for fear to catch up. But during those drifting weeks across the Caribbean and Central America, something remarkable began to happen. The gold, once hidden in the belly of La Luz, like a sleeping monster, started to move. Not in headlines, not in secret deals, but in quiet, deliberate pieces, one bar at a time, one truth at a time. Luis had a network. Old sailors, retired dock workers, activists, people who knew how to navigate both seas and secrets. They weren't wealthy, they weren't powerful, but they understood loyalty, history, and justice. With their help, the bars were transported safely to trusted contacts who could liquidate them discreetly, turning gold that once fueled violence into funds that could finally do something good. Each time a piece of gold changed hands, Elena felt both a relief and a pang of grief. Gold had taken so much from her family. It had stolen Diego's life, stolen Mateo's freedom, stolen decades of safety and belonging. And yet now, that same gold was becoming something else, something Mateo had believed in long before anyone else did. For every bar sold, money was wired directly, quietly, anonymously, to the Museo de la Memoria Nacional, a cultural institution in Panama dedicated to preserving the stories of those lost during decades of coups, dictatorships, and foreign interference. They had always lacked the funding to expand, to archive testimonies, to open new wings dedicated to forgotten heroes. Now, for the first time, they could. And it didn't stop there. A new scholarship fund was created, named only Fondo del Amanecer, the Dawn Fund. It offered full academic support to the grandchildren of victims from the 1968 coup. Children whose families were once labeled traitors for daring to oppose corruption. Imagine the symbolism. Gold, once drenched in blood, becoming the reason a young girl could study law, or a boy could become a historian, or a teacher could return to school. Justice rarely arrives in grand gestures. Sometimes justice comes quietly, in classrooms, in opportunities, in the preservation of memory. As the gold flowed into these projects, Elena watched from afar. Through encrypted updates Dana forwarded, photos of construction sites, new archival rooms, students holding acceptance letters with hands shaking from disbelief. None of them knew where the money came from. None of them knew the cost. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that, for the first time in half a century, something was being repaired. Something that had been broken long before Elena was born. Meanwhile, the Whitmore family began to splinter. The federal investigation Dana's story had triggered quickly gained traction. Whispers turned into subpoenas. Old business deals were re-examined. Shell companies collapsed under scrutiny. Charles Whitmore was caught on camera assaulting a reporter who asked about the missing gold. Olivia vanished from public life entirely. Eleanor released a polished denial video, but even her perfectly crafted words couldn't erase the cracks forming beneath the dynasty her family had built on secrecy. For people who had spent their whole lives rewriting the narrative, they suddenly found themselves unable to control their own story. As the investigation deepened, public pressure grew. Journalists dug into Cold War archives, uncovering patterns of political manipulation, covert operations, and stolen wealth. Historians published think pieces. Activists demanded accountability. People in Panama held vigils for the officers executed in 1968. Their families, finally seeing the world, acknowledge what they'd always known in their bones, that the men labeled traitors had died protecting their country. That truth, once a whisper, was now an echo across two nations. For Elena, the transformation was bittersweet. Each piece of gold returned brought her closer to completing her grandfather's mission and farther from any path back to normal life. Sometimes at night, sitting on a borrowed porch in Costa Rica while Noah slept inside, she wondered what would have happened if she'd taken the Whitmore's offer, if she had walked away, bought a small home in some quiet place, and never looked back. But deep down, she knew such a life would have been built on the same silence that had suffocated her family for generations. Instead, she chose something else, the harder path, the heavier truth. She learned that healing doesn't come from erasing the past. Healing comes from facing it, naming it, and returning what was stolen. Healing comes when a nation's memory is restored, when the forgotten are honored, when buried stories are brought into the light. By the time the last of the gold was rerouted, the world had changed. The Whitmores were no longer untouchable. The museum had launched a permanent exhibit titled Oro de Sangre, La Verdad Recuperada, Blood Gold, the Recovered Truth. And the Dawn Fund had already accepted its first class of scholarship students, each one stepping into a future that had once been denied to their families. And somewhere across those months of quiet movement and restored truth, Elena felt something new bloom within her. Not safety, not comfort, but peace. A peace her grandfather never got to feel. A peace her great-uncle died believing might one day exist. The gold had been returned. But more importantly, the story had been returned. And soon, Elena would too. Because the journey wasn't over yet. Not until she stepped back onto U.S. soil and faced the life awaiting her. A life she had reshaped with courage she never knew she possessed. The gold was home. Now, it was her turn. 6 months after the final shipment of gold reached Panama, Elna stepped off a commercial flight onto Florida soil with Noah's sleepy hand wrapped inside hers. There were no reporters waiting, no government agents, no shadows moving behind pillars. The world had moved on, at least on the surface. But for Elena, the air tasted different, lighter, freer, as if every breath carried the quiet acknowledgement of a burden finally set down. She wasn't returning as the woman who had left. She was returning as someone who had witnessed the worst of power, the best of courage, and the weight of a truth that refused to die. Donna was waiting for them at the airport, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt instead of her usual blazer, her smile warm and real. "Anonymous donors," she said with a wink, handing Elena keys to a modest rental house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind with trimmed lawns, kids on bicycles, and the soft hum of normal life drifting between porches. Elena didn't ask who the donors were. She didn't need to. Some acts of gratitude don't require explanation. The house wasn't big, but it had 2 bedrooms, a working air conditioner, and a small backyard where Noah immediately began chasing the neighbor's dog with the kind of laughter Elena thought she'd never hear again. She stood in the doorway watching him, her chest tightening with a warmth that felt almost foreign. This wasn't luxury, this wasn't wealth, but it was stability, something she'd spent years chasing with empty pockets and tired hands. And now she could finally rest. Life settled into a rhythm. Elna found work at a marine repair shop, and the owner, an older woman with calloused palms and kind eyes, never asked too many questions. Noah made friends, brought home school drawings, begged for soccer cleats. For the first time in years, Elena allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't collapse under the weight of fear. Yet every night after Noah went to bed, she would sit on the small porch and pull out the single thing she'd kept from La Luz, a plaque molded from one of the melted gold bars, engraved with the words she had chosen herself. For Captain Diego Herrera and Mateo Alvarez, your truth endured. Holding it in her hands, she realized something important. She had spent so much of her life believing she came from nothing, that her family history was an empty page, but now she understood the truth. She had inherited not gold, not wealth, not status, but courage, integrity, a lineage of people who chose righteousness even when it cost them everything. And that kind of inheritance is heavier than gold, but infinitely more precious. Months later, Elena and Noah traveled to Panama for the opening of the new exhibit at the National Museum of Memory. The building buzzed with families, students, historians, and the quiet hum of overdue recognition. Elena wandered through the gallery, pausing at photos of soldiers who had been executed, stories once distorted, finally restored to dignity. And then she saw it, the portrait of Captain Diego Herrera, standing proud in his uniform, the plaque beneath it reading, "A patriot whose truth survived half a century of silence." An elderly woman approached her slowly, leaning on a cane. Her eyes were familiar, dark, steady, filled with grief and pride. "You must be Elena," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am Rosa Herrera. Diego was my father." Elena's breath caught. Rosa reached out with frail hands and held hers tightly. "My mother died believing he was a traitor. My brothers grew up ashamed." But now, she gestured toward the exhibit, her eyes filling with tears. "Now the world knows who he really was. You gave us that. Your family gave us our history back." Elena hugged her, feeling decades of pain dissolve into something softer, something healing. And as they stood together, surrounded by the preserved memories of a turbulent past, Elena understood the final lesson her journey had been trying to teach her. Truth is not just a fact, it is an inheritance. It belongs to everyone who comes after. And when we choose truth over silence, we don't just fix the past, we protect the future. On the flight home, Noah leaned against her shoulder, staring out the window at the clouds. "Mom," he whispered, "are we done now?" The question wasn't about danger, it was about purpose. And Elena smiled softly, brushing a hand through his hair. "We're never done with the truth," she said, "but we're finally free to live." The story could have ended there, neatly wrapped and resolved. But life rarely works that way. Sometimes legacies linger. Sometimes they ripple. Sometimes a story that begins with a rusted boat and a forgotten inheritance ends by raising new questions. How many truths are still buried in silence? How many families live with stories they never got to hear? How many histories were written by the powerful, waiting for someone brave enough to rewrite them? What matters most isn't the gold. It isn't the danger. It isn't even the justice that finally came. The real inheritance, the one Elena will pass to Noah, and Noah to his own children, is this, that the truth is worth fighting for, even when the world tells you to stay quiet. And that courage, even in the hands of a single mother who started with nothing, can reshape history one small act at a time. And so, Elena's story doesn't truly end here. It opens, wide, hopeful, unafraid, into the lives shaped by the gold she returned, the families healed by the truth she exposed, and the child who will grow up knowing exactly where he comes from. Some inheritances come in bars of precious metal, but the rarest ones come in the form of memory, justice, and the resolve to carry a story further than anyone believed possible. And those are the legacies that last forever.